Welcome, everyone, on today's educational session hosted by National Interstate and Vanliner Insurance. Our content today will be delivered by Trucksafe Consulting and Hall Compliance. We'll be focusing on the top critical and acute FMCSR violations across the industry from the past year and discussing effective strategies to address them. I'm Chloe Dial, and I'll be your moderator for today's session. As we go through the presentation, feel free to drop your questions in the chat. We'll try to get to as many as we can at the end. Before we dive in, I'd like to give a quick overview of National Interstate and Vanliner Insurance and introduce our two presenters, Brandon Wiseman from Trucksafe Consulting and Timothy Henry from Hall Compliance. National Interstate Insurance Company, along with our wholly owned subsidiary, Vanliner Insurance Company, is part of the Great American Insurance Group family. We offer innovative insurance solutions and a world-class customer service for a variety of commercial transportation industries. Our commitment to delivering exceptional value and relationship-driven insurance experience has remained strong over the decades. With over 30 years in business, we've established ourselves as a national leader in wheels-based transportation insurance. We serve industries like trucking, passenger transportation, crane and heavy haul, moving and storage, parcel delivery, and waste. We strive to understand the unique challenges of each industry we serve, using our policy design experience, preventative loss control insights, and unmatched claims expertise to provide tailored solutions. Our approach is more than just a policy. It's a comprehensive commitment to providing innovative insurance solutions tailored at your unique needs. Our team boasts deep expertise across the commercial transportation industry, ensuring that we understand the specific challenges you face. We pride ourselves on delivering relationship-driven, world-class customer experience supported by proven claims and loss control experts who truly understand your businesses. This combination allows us to offer unparalleled service and support, helping you to navigate the complexities of the industry with confidence. One of our biggest differentiators is our loss control services. To help with that, we have a team of loss control consultants located throughout the United States. Each team member is a wheels-based specialist who understands the risks associated with the industry and the necessary control measures. A regionalized approach allows team members to be closer to clients, resulting in a higher level of service, more touch points, and regional expertise. We also assist in technology by providing solutions to help your insureds become safer motor carriers. Our loss control dashboard offers hundreds of safety resources for managers, drivers, and labor positions. We also provide a fully customizable learning management system and a telematic subsidy programs to help with the cost of technology and increasing adaptation rates, and helping our insureds focus on behaviors that lead to better outcomes. I'm excited to introduce Brandon from Trucksafe Consulting and Timothy from Hall Compliance. Brandon is a transportation attorney, safety consultant, and the founder of Trucksafe Consulting. Over the years, he has represented some of the nation's leading motor carriers and transportation providers on the US DOT safety and compliance matters. Trucksafe Consulting is a full-service DOT regulatory compliance consulting and training service. They help carriers develop, implement, and improve their safety programs through the personalized service and industry-leading training resources. Timothy is the CEO and co-founder of Hall Compliance, which is an AI-powered platform that monitors compliance, safety, and risk across drivers, vehicles, and equipment. It monitors driver qualification, vehicle maintenance, hours of service, and drug and alcohol requirements. Brandon and Timothy, welcome, and we appreciate you being here today.
Thanks, Chloe.
Thanks.
First of all, I want to thank National Interstate and the Vanliner folks for having us today. It's been great to work with those folks over the years, and I'm excited to see what they have in store for 2025 for sure. And also happy to share the digital stage here with Tim from Hall, truly one of the leading innovators in the compliance technology space. So it's also been great to get to know Tim and his team over the last couple of years and partner with them pretty closely with what we're doing at Trucksafe for our motor carrier clients. So excited to be here. Thanks everybody for taking some time out of your day to spend with us. I think we've got some interesting stuff to talk about here. Hopefully we don't bore you to death. But as Chloe mentioned, we're going to hit on what we have seen from our perspectives, at least, as being the top critical and acute violations that the FMCSA and its state law enforcement partners have discovered over the last year or so. It's a good time to look back what we've seen from an enforcement perspective over the past year, and with the hopes of trying to avoid these issues from coming up in the new year, kind of a New Year's resolution, I guess you would say. And so makes sense to start off with kind of a level set of what we've seen in terms of FMCSA enforcement. If you follow FMCSA DOT regulations pretty closely, you will know that the past year has been, 2024 has been pretty quiet from a rulemaking front. In other words, we haven't seen the FMCSA push through very many rules over the last year and even into the last few years. But that's not to say that they haven't been active from an enforcement standpoint. The FMCSA certainly serves multiple functions, one of which is developing the rules, the other is enforcing them. And so even if they've been quiet on the rulemaking front, they have been pretty active on the enforcement front. And we see that playing out in the numbers. These numbers that you're seeing on the screen are just some that are available from the FMCSA's, it's called their A&I website. If you're not familiar with this website, I always recommend that folks in this part of our industry dealing with DOT enforcement and regulations and that type of stuff, make yourself familiar with the A&I website. You just Google FMCSA A&I analysis and information, I think is what that stands for. You will find the website, and it is a wealth of statistics and data all about how the FMCSA enforces their regulations, and it's a good place to look for trends. Where is the FMCSA focusing their attention when it comes to regulatory compliance? Where are fleets getting sideways with the DOT, and what types of fines are we seeing, and that type of stuff. So a great place to look for that type of data. And these are just some of the numbers that I pulled that we have seen 2024 year to date. And so right here, the numbers we're looking at are just from roadside inspections, not all that relevant to our topic today, but relevant in one sense at least, which is, as many on this call will know, the more violations a fleet and its drivers incur roadside, the more likely it is that they will be escalated for further enforcement from the FMCSA, usually in the form of a compliance review, which is where those critical and acute violations stem or show up. And we'll get into that in detail here in a minute. But looking at the numbers, 2024 year to date, nearly 3 million commercial motor vehicle inspections conducted by FMCSA state law enforcement partners. And of those nearly 3 million commercial motor vehicle inspections, we saw an out of service rate. So driver and vehicle out of service violations of 538,686 violations. So several trucks and drivers being written up for serious violations, out of service violations. So violations so serious that they have to be shut down and prevented from continuing to operate. So significant number there. And obviously, I don't have to tell you all, out of service violations cause lots of headaches. Certainly on the compliance front, as you incur more and more of those, you put a bigger target on your back for a potential FMCSA audit, but also, just the economics of it, right? The efficiencies of it. As your trucks and drivers are being stopped roadside, you're losing money as those as the cargo is stuck there on the side of the road somewhere, and you have to either repower it or you have to wait for the out of service condition to clear. So a big issue for sure. Moving on to the next slide are some statistics that are a little more relevant to our discussion today, which are looking at the past year what have we seen in terms of the FMCSA and its state partners actually going out and doing DOT audits, federal audits? Well, over the past year, we've seen the FMCSA conduct over 11,000 investigations of regulated motor carriers. And we use the word investigations there. That can encompass a number of different types of investigations that the FMCSA and its state partners conduct, but mostly that's going to be compliance reviews, or DOT audits, as some will call them. Essentially, them coming in and taking a look at your compliance-related records, driver files, vehicle files, hours of service documents, and everything in between. So over 11,000 of those, which may sound like a big number, by itself, but if you compare that against the sheer number of regulated motor carriers that are operating in the U.S., which is now north of 800,000, it's a pretty small number, relatively speaking. And so this is one reason why the FMCSA has announced earlier this year that it is starting to think about new ways to better enforce its regulations, and more ways that it can touch a bigger universe of the carriers that it is charged with regulating, namely potentially tying a carrier's safety rating to their CSA scores, which would be a significant shift away from the system that we have now. But suffice it to say, for this point, that's how many investigations we saw the FMCSA conduct this year. And of those investigations that were conducted, the FMCSA or its state partners have written up nearly 11,000 of these critical/acute violations, a significant number. And those are the types of violations, as we'll get into, that are the most significant. Those are the ones that tend to cause fleets significant trouble in the context of these investigations. So big numbers, an important topic that we touch on, obviously. So what are these critical and acute violations, and why do they matter so much? Well, some of you are inevitably going to be familiar with this, but for those who aren't, real quickly, when the FMCSA or its state partners, I keep saying that phrase, I'm going to just use FMCSA from here on out. Just recognize that when the FMCSA is doing investigations, it does so through its own employees and also through its relationships with state law enforcement. So even though you may, if you're an Ohio-based carrier, you may see the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio coming in to do these types of compliance reviews, but they're doing so on behalf of the FMCSA. So those are federal audits. So really no distinction between the two other than who's conducting them, but the consequences are the exact same. So when the FMCSA is coming in to do a compliance review, they are looking, if you've ever dug into what the FMCSA calls its safety fitness determination methodology, how they issue safety ratings, they are coming in and they are generally looking at your compliance in 6 factors. If you are unlucky enough to get called up for a DOT audit, they are generally going to look at 6 factors. Sometimes they look at fewer than that, and those are generally called focused audits. But if they're going to do a full compliance review, they are going to look at 6 factors generally. They are a driver factor, actually a general compliance factor. So things like, do you have the right insurance on file, that type of stuff. Then you have a driver factor, which encompasses driver qualification and drug and alcohol testing, if your drivers are subject to those. Then we have the hours of service factor. So they're going to look at a sample of your driver logs or time cards if you're short haul. They are going to look at vehicle maintenance, digging into your vehicle files and making sure you got up-to-date annual inspections and driver inspections and all of that fun stuff. They will look at hazmat if you haul hazmat. And then they will look at your accident factor. How many DOT recordable accidents have you incurred per million miles traveled? And so they're looking at those 6 factors. And what are they looking for specifically? Well, they are looking for violations of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations and the hazardous materials regulations if you're subject to them. It's a pretty broad statement, though, because as many of you will know, those regulations are numerous, voluminous, in fact. If you've got a copy of the Green Book somewhere tucked away, I've got dozens of them in my office somewhere. But there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of regulations that regulated trucking companies and their drivers may be subject to. And so, are they looking for violations of all of those regulations? Yes, they are, in fact. But is it all of those regulations that can cause you trouble in an audit? Well, certainly the FMCSA, if they're doing an audit, they're going to write you up for every single violation that their investigator discovers in the context of those audits. But a lot of those are pretty minor violations. And so what they're really truly focused on in a compliance review are so-called critical and or acute violations. And as their names imply, these are the violations that the FMCSA has deemed to be the most serious. In other words, the most indicative of future crash risk. And so these are the types of violations that can really cause trouble in an audit. They are the ones that will impact potentially a motor carrier safety rating, their regulatory lifeblood to keep operating. If the DOT discovers enough critical and acute violations according to their methodology in an audit, then the carrier will receive a downgraded safety rating. And if that rating is unsatisfactory, it's a three-tier system that many of you are familiar with, three tiers being satisfactory, conditional, or unsatisfactory. If they find enough of these critical and acute violations to render you unsatisfactory, your entire fleet is going to get shut down. You are going to get an operational out of service order, and you're going to be prohibited as a fleet from continuing to operate vehicles in interstate or intrastate commerce. So it doesn't get much more serious than that. And then even if you were to get a conditional rating, that middle tier rating, it doesn't prevent you from operating, but it can still cause significant problems for you, particularly if you are a for-hire fleet. Carriers that end up with a conditional rating because of the acute and critical violations discovered in an audit will often find that they will lose business as a result of that rating. Many shippers and brokers refuse to do business with a conditionally rated carrier. And also, it can impact your insurance premiums. Carriers with conditional ratings tend to see higher insurance premiums as a result. And so the consequences are pretty severe from the discovery of these types of violations in an audit. So I really can't overstress the importance of watching out for these particular types of violations. And we're going to go through the most common ones that we've seen over the past year. But those are the consequences, not to mention the civil penalties that can stem from these types of violations. Often, if a critical or acute violation is discovered in an audit, not only will it lead to a downgraded safety rating, but you'll also get the hammer dropped on you in terms of civil penalties. And then, certainly on, putting the lawyer hat back on here, putting aside regulatory compliance completely, the trouble that these types of violations can cause in highway accident litigation is something else I cannot overstress. If you've been tagged with these types of violations from an audit, it is going to be something that becomes publicly available for all to see. And then if, God forbid, your driver gets involved in a bad accident after the discovery of these violations, you better believe that the fact that you've been tagged with these violations is going to be paraded by the plaintiff's attorney in that litigation in front of the jury. And it's going to be used to cast you as a bad actor, somebody who has systemic compliance issues, someone who, according to the plaintiff's bar, is worthy of the jury's ire in terms of imposing some kind of punitive damages as a result of your systemic noncompliance. So that's enough scaring the crap out of you, I suppose. Suffice it to say, the stakes are high here, and so that's why we want to watch out for these violations. Certainly, we want to watch out for any violations, but these types of violations in particular carry the most severe consequences, and they're the ones we need to focus on before moving on to the other, non-critical and acute violations. So, what renders violations acute and critical? Well, the regulations, Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations, spell these out. In fact, there's an entire list of the critical and acute regulations contained within Appendix B to Part 385. That's the last bullet point there. I'm going to bounce back to the two bullet points before it, though, to say that that's the part that defines or that spells out what are the critical and acute violations. But generally speaking, acute regulations are those identified as such where noncompliance is so severe as to require immediate corrective actions by a motor carrier, regardless of the overall safety posture of that motor carrier. These are the top of the top in terms of the seriousness of the violations, acute violations. That definition is just pulled straight out of the regulation of what an acute regulation is. And then you can go to that Appendix B to Part 385 to see the list of acute regulations. A good example, we'll get to others here in a minute, but just to give you a sense of what we're talking about here. A good example of an acute regulation would be continuing to use a driver after he or she has tested positive for drugs or alcohol. So obviously, if they test positive for drugs or alcohol, you have to pull them immediately out of a commercial motor vehicle. And if you continue to use them despite getting that positive drug or alcohol test, that would be obviously a very serious violation. That would be an acute violation. So the point there is it only takes one of those acute violations in an audit to potentially end up with a downgraded safety rating. Literally one occurrence of an acute violation could screw you over in that context. But what about critical regulations? Well, the appendix defines those as violations identified as such where noncompliance relates to management and or operational controls. They are indicative of a breakdown in a carrier's management controls. So not so much an acute issue where you're looking for one instance, but for critical regulations, the DOT is essentially looking for what they call a pattern of noncompliance. It takes more than one violation of a critical regulation to potentially downgrade your safety rating in an audit. How many does it take? I think this is on the next slide, so we can go to the next slide here. How many does it take? It takes 10%, a 10% violation rate or higher. So if this is actually the list of acute and critical, a partial list of these. This is what you would see if you were to navigate to Appendix B to Part 385. You can see this is a very long list, but this is just a portion of it for you to get a sense of the types of issues we're talking about here. We can go to the next slide. To my earlier point, critical violations require a 10% or higher violation rate. So to give you an example, if the DOT is in your office looking at a sample of driver logs, driver records of duty status for hours of service compliance, and they pick 100 on-duty days for drivers, sample sizes vary by your fleet size, but to make the math easy, since I'm terrible at math, they pick 100 on-duty days worth of logs that they want to look at. If they find 10 or more of those logs have a particular type of hours of service violation, so let's say an 11-hour violation, they find 10 or more 11-hour violations out of those 100 on-duty days worth of logs, that's a critical level violation. And that will, in the hours of service factor specifically, that will lead to a downgraded safety rating. And so you could see here that whether it be through acute violations or critical violations, it doesn't take a whole lot to negatively impact your safety rating in an audit. And that's why these are so critical. Critical and acute violations negatively impact a carrier's safety rating in an audit, and then you suffer all of the consequences that flow from a downgraded safety rating. I hope that makes sense. If you could go back real quick, one slide. I've already kind of hit on these, but I want to reiterate them. So a single acute violation in any of those 6 factors that I mentioned at the start could potentially lead to a downgraded safety rating. And a single critical violation in any of those factors could also potentially lead to a downgraded safety rating. The reason I say potentially is because there's math involved to what you end up with as your final safety rating. There's a methodology to it. You will also find that in Appendix B to Part 385. It depends on your factor ratings in those 6 factors that I mentioned that drives your overall safety rating coming out of an audit. We don't have time to get into the nitty-gritty of that, but one thing I want to point out is just to show you how easy it is to end up with a downgraded safety rating. And as we'll get into in the most common critical and acute violations that we see, the number one, at least in my experience, I think the data bears this out, but certainly anecdotally speaking, the number one driver for a downgraded safety rating, in my experience, is a critical level violation discovered in the hours of service factor. And most often, I can even drive that down further to say that the number one contributor to downgraded safety ratings is log falsification by drivers. That is what I think the data bears out. That is certainly what we are seeing in our experience. Why is that? It turns out it's that way because of this methodology that the DOT has set up for the way that it assigns safety ratings. And of those 6 factors that I listed off at the beginning, general compliance, driver, hours of service, vehicle maintenance, hazmat, and accident rate, of those 6 factors, hours of service in particular is the only factor where any of these critical and acute violations discovered by the DOT are actually double weighted. So you can kind of think of this in any of the other factors. If you got a critical or an acute violation in any of the other factors, that would be 1 point. But in the hours of service factor specifically, a critical or an acute violation in that factor carries 2 points. And if we had the safety rating methodology up here, you would see that you cannot get out of an audit with a failed factor, which you would fail in the hours of service factor if you got one critical or acute violation. You cannot get out of that audit with anything better than a conditional safety rating. So literally, one critical violation in the hours of service factor, and you've got an automatic conditional safety rating out of that audit and the consequences that flow from that conditional safety rating. And so then you can just extrapolate from there. It doesn't take much more in the other factors to then leave you with an unsatisfactory safety rating and then a potential fleet-wide shutdown. Okay, now we can go to the next slide. So what are the top critical and or acute violations that we are seeing roadside? And what do we do to prevent them, more importantly? Not roadside, in an audit. What are the top critical violations that we're seeing in an audit? Here they are, listed out. Again, this data is available on the FMCSA's A&I website, a great resource. Here are the top critical level violations. We'll just go through them. And then I'll spend some time on the ones that I see as the most problematic. I'm not going to spend time on all of them. But the number one critical level violation that's discovered in an audit is speeding, which also happens to be the number one violation discovered in a roadside inspection. It didn't used to be the case that these speeding violations impacted you in a safety, in a compliance review, but they now do. It is now listed as a critical violation to have a certain number of speeding violations that are highlighted in an audit. And these are easy pickings for an investigator, as you would expect. They already have all your roadside data from the CSA platform, right? So when they're coming into audit, it's not like they're discovering new speeding violations in that audit. They already have a list of all of them. So depending on your occurrence of speeding violations throughout your fleet, you may already start off with a critical level violation before the audit's even really kicked off, based on the number of speeding violations that you have incurred. And that's what we're seeing in the data. The data suggests that that is the top critical level violation now in a compliance review. Following that, and it's not one I'm going to get into in terms of recommended course of action, because what is there to say about fixing a speeding issue? You know, make your drivers quit speeding. What else can I tell you other than that? And that's certainly, I understand, easier said than done, but that's the reality of it. So then, working down the list here, these others, there is more nuance to how we get control of these issues. And I'm looking forward to hearing from Tim about how technology plays a role in this. But false records of duty status, that's the one I've already kind of highlighted. Historically, that has been the number one driver for downgraded safety ratings, is false records of duty status. We'll get into why that's the case, but very common for those to cause problems in an audit, followed by another hours of service related violation, which is drivers not using or not keeping track of their hours using the appropriate method that is required to track their hours. So this would be a case where maybe a driver has not used an electronic logging device to track their hours of service compliance when they were supposed to, and so they get written up for that type of violation. Very common. Using a driver before receiving a pre-employment drug test result, another critical level violation, very common, where we see that come up. And then last on this list of top 5 critical level violations are drivers not keeping inquiries into driving records in the driver's DQ files. So on that driver factor, certainly one of the things that the DOT is going to be focused on if they're reviewing a sample of your driver qualification files is that you have run motor vehicle reports on all of your drivers, and that you do so before at the time of hire, and then at least annually thereafter. And if you're not keeping copies of those MVRs or you're not doing them, that's a critical level violation if they find enough of those missing based on the sample size. We can go to the next slide. What about the top acute violations? Again, the ones where it only takes one to cause significant trouble. Well, here are the top acute violations according to the FMCSA's A&I data. The first, very common violation, both roadside and in an audit, which is allowing a driver to drive with a suspended, revoked, downgraded, etc. CDL. So drivers supposed to have a valid CDL if they're operating certain types of equipment, namely those over 26,000 pounds. And if the driver is out there driving that equipment and has lost their CDL for one reason or another, you're going to get tagged with these violations. And if they come up in an audit, all it takes is one to potentially cause the downgrade. So very important issue to watch out for. Happens, actually, we'll get into that in a second. Number 2 on this list, using a commercial vehicle that has not been periodically inspected. So these are the annual DOT inspections that you're supposed to have all of your regulated equipment subjected to. Just not having those up to date in the files, and continuing to operate it out on the roads without having it be up to date on its annual inspection. All it takes is one of those. And then the third one would be failing to maintain a DQ file. If you don't even have a DQ file for a particular driver, that would be an acute violation, assuming that driver is subject to the DQ requirements. So, an observation here, certainly fewer acute violations discovered in 2024 than critical violations, but still a good number of them discovered. So let's talk then about how we avoid, at least from my perspective, how we avoid some of these most common critical and acute violations. We've worked with a lot of fleets over the years and have counseled them on some things to think about to avoid these types of violations specifically. So I'll give you my insights, and then I'll turn it over to Tim to give you his insights. So we can go to the next slide here. So log falsifications, I want to spend a little bit of time on that one for the reasons I've already mentioned and won't rehash. But the most common contributing factors that I see to log falsifications, and by extension to downgraded safety ratings, number 1 on that list nowadays is personal conveyance misuse. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of personal conveyance, but just know that drivers misusing that status on their ELD or even on paper logs, if you still got drivers on paper logs, putting themselves in off-duty personal conveyance status and doing so in a way where the FMCSA's personal conveyance guidance does not allow them to do it, that is a very common contributor to log falsifications. Pretty easy to sniff out, too. And so if an FMCSA investigator is in your office focusing on hours of service, you better be sure that they are looking at your driver's logs and they are looking primarily for personal conveyance misuse. The one we see most common, backing up a little just to say that drivers and carriers just not understanding what is a permissible use of personal conveyance or not, that is usually the root cause of these violations. And I can't fault you too much for that, because the FMCSA itself has wavered on that issue over the years, and its guidance is pretty complex on what constitutes legitimate personal conveyance use or not. But still, the point is, it's a very common contributor to violations, and carriers need to get a handle on it. I've seen carriers do everything from turning it off completely, which I think is a good move for carriers that don't need the flexibility of personal conveyance status, just turning it off completely and avoiding the headache altogether. But for those that can't do that and that need to use it, you at least need to have some controls in place to make sure your drivers aren't abusing that. So things like limitations on its use, maybe a temporal limitation. Drivers can use it no more than an hour per day. That's a pretty common control I see. But more than anything, really, the thing that tends to go the furthest is making sure your drivers are fully educated on what is a permissible personal conveyance use and what is not. There's really no substitute for that. Unidentified driving, another common contributor, drivers just not logging into their ELD devices and taking off down the road. They or you may think that that's a way to get them some extra hours, but I'm telling you, it's a bad idea. That unidentified driving time, the time that's not assigned to any particular driver, is living on that device, whether somebody's logged into it or not. And the DOT is going to find that out, is going to see that unidentified driving time, certainly in an audit. It can even come up in a roadside investigation. And if they see that unidentified driving time that isn't assigned to a driver, then guess what? That's going to end up as a log falsification, because there's some funny business going on if you're incurring significant segments of unidentified driving. So you need to have processes in place to control that. I talked about the solutions. Let's move on because I'm running out of time here. I want to turn it over to Tim. Driver qualification, I'm going to leave this mostly to Tim because I think he's got a pretty slick solution to handling this, and he's got good insights on how to handle these. The biggest issues I see in this area, and I'll leave it at that, are just keeping on top of expiration dates on all of the things that expire in a driver qualification file. So licenses, CDLs, med cards, MVRs that are run annually, annual reviews of driving records. All of those things have an expiration date. And if you're not keeping on top of when those things expire and you're letting them lapse, well, now you're just opening yourself up to critical level violations in an audit. So you got to keep on top of the expiration dates, and then also just knowing what type of license is required for the types of equipment that you are expecting your drivers to operate. And not just the license, also any necessary endorsements. If you're operating certain types of specialized equipment that requires an endorsement, make sure your drivers have it and keep on top of that. Make sure that you have processes in place to check the status of your driver's license. There's a service out there now that several offer. It's called continuous license monitoring, where those platforms are automatically notifying you if something about your driver's license status changes, and they will usually do so pretty quickly, within a few days max. And that gives you the ammunition you need to then take swift action to get those drivers off the road until the issue is rectified. That's not a required service under the regs, but it is invaluable in my opinion. All right, next slide. CDL violations, same thing I just mentioned. Education goes a long way in making sure that you know what types of license is required for what types of equipment. And then drugs and alcohol, I'll leave it here. As we saw in the data, a very common contributor. What I've found over the years is that often fleets that don't have a good handle on drug and alcohol testing, a lot of them just don't know when those rules apply and to whom they apply. So again, education plays a big role in it. And then, as we saw, one of the more common critical level violations is carriers not waiting to get that verified negative pre-employment drug screen result back before allowing their newly hired drivers to get out there and start operating. You got to wait till you get that negative test result back, obviously. And so making sure you have those controls in place to do the vetting that you need to be doing on your drivers before turning them loose out there on the roads goes a long way. You can see there the other solution is make sure you're using the clearinghouse. We could spend 2 hours talking about the clearinghouse, and I've done that on separate webinars. But the clearinghouse, I'm still astonished, 5 years into the clearinghouse, how many fleets still don't even know that it exists, let alone are using it. And it's a huge gap for you. If you have CDL drivers, if you have drivers operating CDL-sized equipment for you, you got to be using the clearinghouse. The clearinghouse is your sanity check on whether these drivers have had a disqualifying drug or alcohol violation in the past. And if they do, then you cannot be using them until they go through the return to duty process. And so just so many fleets missing out on that and not doing the required checks through the clearinghouse, and then they don't have any visibility to these types of issues. Very easy to prevent that by just using the clearinghouse. All right. Is that the end of mine, or did I have another slide? All right, Tim, turning it over to
Well,
you.
thanks, Brandon. I really appreciate it. And I think you've done a great job just really highlighting how complex this is. I think if anyone does not feel overwhelmed, I don't know, this is pretty complicated. And so I want to acknowledge everyone on this webinar is that it is complicated, but the good thing is that there are solutions like Hall that can really help augment your process today. Again, my goal is to be able to zoom out. Obviously, I represent Hall, but you know, good processes, the right domain expertise around the table can really help really create a right solution for your team. You may be too small for what Hall provides, but does not exclude you of having a great process that helps you follow what the regulations require you to do. So my goal is to really even focus on just a handful of critical and acute violations that everyone on this webinar can actually manage today. If we go to the next slide, just to really highlight kind of the world you guys live in, it is complex to manage compliance, maintenance, and safety of fleets of all sizes. Hall, we work with some of the largest for-hire fleets in North America, but also work with a lot of fleets or 10 fewer power units who still need to abide by the same regulations required by the DOT, but also that are really thinking about how do I maintain my equipment so I have uptime. And I think Brandon mentioned on fleets not using drivers that haven't cleared a pre-employment drug screen. That's just the incentive, right? Let's acknowledge that. If my wheels aren't moving, we're not billing, right? That's just the reality of our space. So again, I want to acknowledge like the incentives are not aligned sometimes for us to take our time, and that's just a reality. And if we go to the next slide, Hall's goal, any process really should help you reduce the noise. There's so many different vendors to use, from just maintaining the DOT compliance of your fleet or just maintaining a rock star safety program, let alone making sure that the maintenance of your equipment is up to date. But the insurance, right? There are requirements that your insurance providers do require you to follow: the age of a driver or the age of equipment. Juggling all this is complex. So again, my goal is to be able to here at Hall is really be able to create a solution that saran wraps that problem and really help you manage these core workflows best in class. If we go to the next slide, just anchoring this to kind of what fleets really need are just a one unified view of everything. Again, that is what we're creating here at Hall. But if we go to the next slide, just given the time, let's just focus on tactical things, right? That everyone on this call can do to make sure that they maintain. Actually, if we bring it down to a driver qualification file, Brandon, if you are required to maintain DQF files for your drivers, you know, you have to go beyond just having this document. What we see in our world is that fleets really want to understand the exact requirements of the driver qualification file. Brandon mentioned a clearinghouse query, which is sometimes when we talk to fleets who are interested in what we're building here, they're like, what is that? How can I use that? Just for context, for maybe folks who just don't know, the clearinghouse is a really clear opportunity for any employer who may want to hire a driver to be able to run a query to check, hey, has Tim Henry ever been failed a drug screen? The problem right now with hiring is that if you don't do that, you don't ever have an idea if Tim Henry failed before, right? And if you hire Tim Henry into your fleet, and let's say there is an accident and they do some investigation, you're liable. It's just a reality. But with with the integration that Hall provides with the clearinghouse, this is automatic. We're able to run that query and see was there a hit on Tim Henry before. That's one example of these traditional offline SOPs, standard operating procedures that your team follows day in, day out. But the problem is just acknowledging the obvious. Team members come and go. The person who may have been the compliance czar the past 5 years within your fleet, they may retire, and all that DOT experience goes with them. But being able to make sure you're following the right steps when it comes to building out a DQ file is required. And that's what any solution should do is really allow you to step by step understand what needs to be there. So clearinghouse, one example, Brandon highlighted a really other great example of what's becoming standard with NVR monitoring. With our integration partners, this is becoming standard, not only just doing pre-employment NVR pulls, but continuous monitoring. And Brandon, maybe you have some thoughts here. I think it's going to become standard. More and more, if you're not doing that, a plaintiff attorney is going to say, hey, you weren't willing to pay an extra dollar per driver per month to make sure that they were safe on the road. That argument to combat that is becoming harder. I'm not saying you have to do it, but these technologies, the cost point are coming so low for you to really create a holistic compliance solution. It's there, it's live, and it's ready to be used. And I really am seeing from afar that it's almost becoming standard in the coming years.
To that point, Tim, what we've seen is obviously it's not always a nefarious situation.
Yeah.
Sometimes drivers just lose their license without even knowing it themselves. Maybe they missed a child support payment, or they didn't pay a parking ticket that they didn't know that they have, and next thing they know, they've got a downgraded CDL. And if they're out on the road, maybe they didn't get notice of it in their physical mailbox. So now you got a driver out there driving without a valid CDL, and it was totally innocent the way that it
Yep.
occurred. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter in
Doesn't
the
matter.
context that Tim's talking about it in that highway accident litigation. If it happened, you better believe that the plaintiff's bar is going to stick that to you in that context.
Yeah, and the one thing, for example, what technology can do is connect the dots and at least try to highlight the gap. So, for example, with the integration partner, with let's say our Asama Safety is the NVR integration partner, one of them. If there's NVR hit, the downgrade of license, we actually notify our users in our system that can actually talk to the ELD and change the status of the driver in Samsara or Motive to actually be able to embed the compliance. Again, that's an example here at Hull that we're really trying to embed DOT compliance within the process. Like that's one extra step we can do to prevent a driver who technically should not be on the road. If we go to the next slide, and again, there's a ton to say here. Again, if you have any questions, drop them in the chat. We'll try to respond to them before the end of the call. Brandon mentioned another one is just maintaining annual inspections of your equipment. Again, if it's moving, it works. Unfortunately, that's not the case, right? We need to make sure from a DOT requirement that we are doing annuals. But I think in our position is that I think equipment should go far and beyond just what is required by the DOT. Really enabling a preventive maintenance program for your equipment and vehicles is utmost important. We fundamentally understand that historically this has been very cost prohibitive, or we have had to rely on Google Sheets and Excel, which work. Again, I'm a firm believer of, really, try to find low cost options to manage a process. But as many of the fleets on this call, I'm sure, want to grow or have grown over the years, sometimes the Google Sheets or Excel sheets no longer work, but you still have to maintain not just the annuals, but also maintenance records. You want to make sure, hey, what's the track record of for asset 1, 2, 3, how many DVIRs, were there any gaps in DVIRs before, right? That highlights like people aren't submitting pre-trip and post-trips, which is becoming standard. We've seen that historically in the for-hire community to do this, but now that's becoming standard for any real vehicle. It's becoming best practice to really enable that pre and post-trip, so you can just get ahead of maintenance issues. It's great for the equipment, your brand's on the side of the truck. You want to make sure your vehicles and equipment are really representing your brand first and foremost, but making sure that you're getting ahead of any downtime, right? That really attacks many revenue at risk. And then from a DOT requirements, fuel, tax, mileage, and license and permitting, again, permits, licensing, living in a PDF in a folder or living in a filing cabinet, if you're not tracking it, they could be expiring, so that truck you may be entering in a state that has invalid, you get pulled over, you say, hey, show me your hazmat certificate. It's like, oh, this is not valid. Like these are things that, again, I always say are kind of really easy to overlook, but really add up, as Brandon mentioned earlier. It's like we keep having these constant violations. I've seen it time and time again with our customer base. A lot of the time they are cut off from a large contract they used to have, or they go out for a renewal and they see that their insurance has increased because fundamentally that fleet has become riskier, quote unquote riskier. And that's just a reality, right? And compliance is a leading indicator of a riskier fleet over time. If we go to the next, I think the big thing I always suggest any fleet, whether they work with Hull or not, is really being able to manage their CSA scores. This is truly your representation to the outside world. A lot of these scores are used either by a broker or a shipper that you want to do business with, or by your insurance provider that's looking to underwrite your operations. So being able to understand how the market is looking at you is really important. It also allows you to get ahead of any inspections and violations. And if we go to the next slide, I think the real goal behind Hall is really allow fleets to manage DOT inspections in first class, meaning understanding for that inspection violation, what driver was it associated with, what piece of equipment, because you can really start understanding a pattern. Is trailer 1, 2, 3 or tractor ABC the piece of equipment that's constantly having these maintenance issues? I mean, what's going on? Is this even worth having on the road? Like, those are business decisions that, unless you're centralizing all this in one place, understanding what the fundamental cost of ownership from an asset perspective, but also on the flip side, from a driver, right? At the end of the day, and the goal of creating a safety program, being able to really associate a driver to violations and understand their overall performance within the fleet. So again, being able to use a system, whether it's an Excel sheet, whether it's a Hull, to really map these patterns, allow compliance, maintenance, and safety professionals to really start understanding patterns. If we keep going, running a little on time. Oh, perfect. Well, hopefully I got through Hull. Again, I think the biggest things I would leave everyone with is, process. Software is really good at embedding process. And again, whether you use Hull or another vendor, I really do think there is some great technology for every fleet on this call to really find gaps and really manage against those gaps. Perfect. That's my time.
And my closing recommendation, is go download that list of acute and critical violations and make sure you don't have any of those in your fleet. That'll go a long way to keeping you out of trouble.
Totally.
Awesome. If you have any questions, you can drop them in the chat. We'll hang around for a couple more minutes here. But I do want to thank both Brandon and Tim for your knowledge and expertise in this space here. Thank you for sharing that with us. If you are a National Interstate or Vanliner customer currently, you do receive preferred pricing on both Trucksafe and Hull compliance. So you can visit our loss control dashboard on Copilot, or you can email losscontrol@natl.com. Again, losscontrol@natl.com to learn more about our products and services. All right, I'm not seeing any questions pop through in the chat. Thank you so much. If anyone has any additional.
I see one question, Chloe, in the Q&A.
Oh,
Jesse's
perfect.
asking, when using the clearinghouse for queries on new hires, do you have to run a full query or is a limited okay? And the answer to the question is, has to be a full query for a pre-employment purpose. So that was an easy one.
Awesome. Have a great rest of your week, everyone. If you have any further questions, feel free to reach out to National Interstate or Tim and Brandon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye now.